Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Ely.
And I'm Daniel Chen. We're just a couple guys talking about some stuff.
Today we have a special edition of the podcast, a special edition that we wish we didn't have to do, but we're going to be talking about the 8 murders that happened, perpetrated by a single individual last week in Atlanta. Last Tuesday, a young man went into 3 different Atlanta area spas and murdered 8 different people. He is in custody now and going through the justice system. So this was a tragedy that hit close to home, both emotionally for many of us in our congregation and literally physically distance-wise, very close to where we are.
So the church that the shooter was a member of is 15 minutes down the street from us, and then where the murders took place, we're all within 30 minutes of where we are.
Very close. So what were when you first heard first reactions, what were you thinking?
I guess, there's sadly enough shootings that we hear about where I was like, man, again.
Isn't that a tragic response? Here we go again.
But you know what? I think and so just to give everyone a heads up, if you're just like a random person listening to this and don't know Justin and I personally, my response to this is going to be a little different than what the cultural narrative is. So just to give you that heads up. But I heard about it from mainly my Asian friends, my Asian American friends. I grew up going to mostly a white school, but going to an almost purely Chinese church. And so I have, kind of 2 worlds when I grew up.
Since this is not a video, do you want to go ahead and state your ethnicity for our listeners?
I am a Chinese. I know. I'm like, we're about to get canceled.
That was him, not me.
And I'm come from Chinese background. I'm called what is called an ABC, American born Chinese. But I heard that from Chinese people, so I can say it. But I heard it mainly from my Asian American friends, and most of it was not even saying, "Here's what happened." It was, we're about to get into this response, but it was. The way I heard about it was, see, this is why Trump saying the China virus was so dangerous. This is why saying Kung flu was so dangerous, because it was like almost like Trump was the one who's responsible for these killings, was the first thing I heard. That's how I heard about it.
Interesting. Wow.
And so my first response was like, what? The term China virus didn't kill anyone. A person did.
Yeah.
And so I think as we went on, we're about to talk about the response and how people responded to it, which I do disagree with how a lot of people responded to it. But ultimately, I think where I landed was, man, I'm just sad for the victims' families.
Yeah.
What a tragedy. What a horrendous act of violence. I mean, and so just because it's 2021, we absolutely condemn the actions and absolutely condemn murder for any reason. So
Yeah, I think my initial thought was just the tragedy of the loss of life, the heinousness of a sin like that. I was immediately struck knowing that the church this guy was a member of is a church that's a part of our pastor's fellowship that we meet with on a monthly basis, and so knowing the church and knowing the pastor and being a pastor, I was immediately just struck of like, wow, what a horrific burden they have to bear. Not nearly the burden of the families of the victims. Not nearly that burden. They carry the worst burden of losing, a mom, a sister, a wife. But my heart went out for those pastors that had to shepherd that church. Very just tragedy all around, right? For the victims, for their families, for the church, for the parents of this guy who were involved in turning him in, and they have to just like basically mourn the loss of their son.
Right.
It's just tragedy all over. But
I would say too, I think something I thought about that isn't talked about much is this guy, the shooter, claimed to be a Christian. And I said, as horrible as this tragedy is, and I do believe God is sovereign, but I did have the thought, man, I would hate if these victims hate God because this person represented God.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. And we'll get into later the Crabapple Baptist and how they've handled it, which I think has really been as good as you could in these circumstances. But we want to turn now for a second. So that was our personal responses to this.
Right.
What was the overall cultural narrative or the media narrative that was the response to this event?
So interesting enough, if you listen to our podcast on Monday, we kind of talked about being consistent with the way you speak and the way you act so that people believe that you are actually for or against something, right? That was kind of what our podcast released on Monday was about. And I thought it was interesting because what it seemed like to me was it was like the world was waiting for the next tragedy so that they could push their agenda. That's how I felt the world response was, because it was so quick people were so quick to place motive on this guy when we had no information. Mm-hmm. We don't know anything about this guy. We just know this guy went to some Asian spas and killed them. And immediately it was blamed on first Trump, right? The China virus, Kung flu.
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess this is all the circles that you travel in. I didn't see any of that.
Yeah,
but you did.
I did from so many Asian American friends.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And then also, it just kind of turned into just racism in general. And even, I don't know if you've seen this hashtag, but the Stop Asian Hate hashtag. Have you seen that one?
That was pretty quick. Yeah.
Okay. And so, and then it became not just my Asian friends, but then my other friends started posting about it. And, doesn't matter what the race was, started posting about just racism in general. And then it turned into this discussion on sexuality and purity culture as more information came out that he said it was because he was
trying to eliminate temptation.
Right. And it became, and part of the rhetoric I would agree with that some Christians were posting, sin is never outside of you. You need to kill the sin inside of you. But we'll talk about that later. I do agree with that. But then it became not just attacking sin, but this idea of purity culture in general, which was really popular in the 90s and early 2000s, which we'll get into. And then, I even read an article by this Asian pastor, a Korean pastor maybe, I don't remember what website I read it on, but he was just basically saying, Crabapple Baptist, which this shooter was a member of, no longer, but was.
Right.
No wonder, I'm not surprised that the shooter came out of this church because of the SBC in general, and then because they're associated with this ministry called the Founders Ministry, who they're against critical race theory, which we're going to do a podcast on later.
Sure.
Not on the Founders Ministry, but on critical race theory. So no wonder this church must have been preaching, the stuff that led him to that. They must have been acting and living in a way where this is. And I think for me, I was just thinking, do any of these people even care about these murders? It just seems like people care about their agenda, and there's so many agendas now.
Yeah. So it seemed like to me, and this was interesting, right? It starts with the accusations of racism, Asian racism.
Right.
You would say from your perspective, it started with it's Trump's fault. And then it moved to it's racism's fault.
And then moved to just white supremacy,
in general.
White privilege, white supremacy's fault.
Then it became kind of Christian evangelicalism and the Christian view of sex, and it's their fault. And then even maybe more specifically, just kind of a subculture of American Christianity, kind of that conservative Southern Baptist culture. But yeah, what I thought was interesting about the response is this whole time, it felt like no one was talking about the fact that 8 people were murdered.
Right.
And like children lost their moms, husbands lost their wives, sisters lost their sister. That was shocking to me how the conversation moved from an individual took the life of 8 people, and how heinous is this and awful to all of these other narratives. And some of them may carry weight, and we'll talk about that a little more. But yeah, it seemed like we missed what happened by it getting buried under other narratives.
And the way I would describe it is people were talking about the victims, but people were yelling about their whatever issue
their
was.
Story.
Yeah.
So in contrast to this, right, we had the opportunity to spend some time with the pastors at Crabapple Baptist the other day and pray with them and hear how their congregation is going. And it's just so interesting to note how much of the narrative that's been just spewing out on the media is not true of their church, right? So they talked about how many Asian members they have within their congregation. Yeah. They talked about hosting a
they
church
let
plant.
an entire Asian church meet in their building every Sunday.
Right. I mean, these are Bible-loving, gospel-believing church.
And I'll say, even my personal response when stuff started coming out against Crabapple is I don't know their pastors intimately that well.
Yeah.
But we're part of this pastors conference, and I've had conversations with them, and I really resented this Korean pastor speaking out against Crabapple in particular, and then the SBC.
Yeah.
For a couple reasons, because I'm like, I don't fit your narrative, guy, because I'm a Asian pastor in the SBC, so you can't just knock the SBC. I'm part of this, and I've never felt safer in my whole life being part of this church.
Yeah.
That's not fair. It's not fair to make these blanket statements.
Right.
Secondly, I've met both their pastors, especially one of the associate pastors who's around our age. And I remember thinking, no, these guys have shown me nothing but kindness, grace, and respect the entire time.
Yeah.
Wonderful, wonderful people.
Yeah.
And I remember just thinking that. And I remember going to the defense, not on social media, because I just...
What's the point?
Yeah.
Almost, yeah.
But as I talked to people, I'm like, no, I know them.
Yeah.
You can't say, like, people are just making these blanket statements. The pastors must have said this, or the church must have been like this.
Yeah.
And it's just not true.
Just slander.
It's not.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're going through a very difficult time. And so they made the decision to act as a biblical church and excommunicate this guy from their membership. So on Sunday, the shootings happened on Tuesday. That following Sunday, during their church service, they excommunicated him and said that this, in accordance with Matthew 18 and 1 Corinthians 5, this brother is not showing any evidence of walking with the Lord, and they removed him from their membership. And so I feel like Crabapple, pray for them. That they've been through a very difficult time. I'm grateful for how they've handled it, and it's tragic beyond words. But it was difficult to watch a good church and good brothers just be slandered around the world, really, with just unsubstantiated claims. And I think that's one of the things that I think we see in these things is. Journalism needs to get a little better at journalizing.
Right.
Just throwing these things out there it just does not help the conversation. It doesn't help the cause of justice to really get to the root issues of something when you throw out issues that may or may not be true from the very beginning.
And that's a good point, because journalism, or even on Facebook, your cry for justice is undermined if you are unjust in your judgment of the person you're trying to get justice from, right? If you're throwing the first stone against Crabapple Baptist or against white people in general or the SBC or whatever, but you have no information or evidence, it undermines your call. Right. And I think even from our experience with Crabapple, I don't know if you would agree with this, all the evidence that we've heard from them is that with the narratives about the racism and the purity culture that exists in the church, that this guy ended up that way because of nurture from how he grew up in his family and church. It's just wrong.
It's not true. Yeah.
The purity culture stuff didn't seem to. They uphold a biblical view of sex,
Yeah.
but it's not like they were these like Pharisees trying to control this young man.
Right.
And this family wasn't like a terrible family trying like making this guy feel constantly telling him he was going to hell or whatever.
Yep.
And it leaving that meeting yesterday, it was almost like no one's talking about the maybe actual reason this happened is that he went off the rails and maybe, and I'm not saying he is, but maybe is a little sociopathic or has something that cost him. And I say that because there are racists out there in the world. And there are sex addicts out in the world that never murder anyone.
Right.
And so this is a way next step that isn't just caused by those two things.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and I even think, I had this thought, if you, like, for me, if I even kill someone in self-defense, I'm shaking and throwing up. I would guess that would be my response. You took someone's life
7 more times.
But to do it multiple times, that's something way more than what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's just awful.
And I would say, meeting with them was eye-opening, I think.
Yeah. So we want to talk through kind of the two things that have been blamed for the murder. And then we're going to talk about kind of the Christian response to that. And we'll do them in reverse order from what was talked about on the media. The media started with race, and then they went to purity culture. We're going to start with purity culture because we think we can do that a little quicker, and then we'll talk about race. So there is a difference, right, between the biblical vision for sex and purity culture. So the biblical vision for sex is that God gave sex as a gift to be used only within the confines of marriage between one man and one woman. And all sexual activity outside the covenant, lifelong bond of marriage is sinful and should be repented of and should be avoided. That's like the Christian sexual ethic.
Right.
That, like, period.
Yeah. That's what you see in the scriptures.
That's what's in the scriptures.
And for me, when people ask, well, why is that the case? Why God designed it like that? And I believe what you see in the scriptures, and maybe this mixed with my own thoughts, is that one of the main themes in the scriptures is oneness.
Yeah.
Unity with God.
Yep.
And in marriage, it's unity with your spouse.
Yeah.
And what sex is the expression, the final, it's the, cornerstone in some ways, right? It's the expression of that unity.
Yep.
And so if you have sex without marriage, just like we're not supposed to have other idols, right?
Yeah.
Worship other gods. We're supposed to have unity with our one God.
Mm-hmm.
What sex is you're having this action of this expression of unity without any commitment.
Yeah.
Right.
That's well said. Yeah.
And so, but why it's such a great thing in marriage and why as married couples you should have sex a lot is because it is expression of that unity and love.
Right.
So the reason it's bad is the same reason it's bad to worship other gods in some ways, right? Is that you're supposed to be committed to the God of the Bible, right? As Christians.
Right.
But same with sex. You're supposed to be committed to your one spouse, and that what you're doing is you're expressing this commitment with your body. I mean, it's more than this, but and that's why the sexual ethic exists.
Yeah. So that's the biblical sexual ethic, and it's a little different, or it's probably a lot different than purity culture, which kind of like grew up in the 1990s, right? And the thought around purity culture was we took the principles of the biblical sexual ethic, and then we added like a lot of stuff and ritual to that. So you had purity rings, you had these pledges that people would sign, the cards, they wouldn't have sex till marriage. You kind of had this undercurrent of teaching that, yeah, like Jesus will forgive you, but this is like the one sin that if you commit this, you've kind of dirtied yourself for the rest of your life. So very, very much like a shame-based kind of view of sex, and like you better obey or else one, you've got a scar the rest of your life that the cross just can't forgive.
Right.
And two, sex is going to be bad for you in marriage if you don't abide by this contract.
It was almost like what I would call the scapegoat sin in the 90s in some ways.
Yeah,
it was like instead of killing all your sin and all your sinful nature,
just this one.
Yeah, and it was carried way too far in a lot of ways. Did you grow up with purity culture?
I didn't, but I grew up with like remnants of it.
Right.
I think like the evangelical youth group world.
Right.
It was impossible not to kind of have remnants of it.
Right.
Did you grow up with it?
I didn't. Chinese church, we don't know anything about purity culture. Not in the like
biblical sense.
We held our
biblical
church
sexual ethic.
Yeah, but
right.
we weren't as ingrained with the wider American culture, so I didn't get it as much as at least I remember. I did get a little bit in college in the ministry as part of, not real bad, just remnants as well.
Yeah. So that's kind of so purity culture was quickly blamed. It's interesting though. Some of the media was blaming purity culture for this. Some of the media was really just blaming a biblical sexual ethic. It wasn't purity culture. It was just that these crazy Christians, this is what happens when you tell people you can only have sex in marriage.
And the narrative becomes, and this doesn't help that if you saw that video of that crazy pastor in Missouri, but some people were saying like, you know what? Boys will just be boys, and guys just struggle with lust. And if a guy lusts after a woman, it's the woman's fault for how she dresses.
Right.
And we would just
awful.
I wanted to address that real quick and just say no. People are responsible for their own sin.
Right.
If I as a man lust after a woman, that's never the woman's fault. There's no situation where she is responsible for my sin.
Yeah, you are to blame for your sin. And that's, by the way, that's a common theme we're going to keep coming back to, which is you are to blame for your sin.
Right. And where this shooter and murderer went wrong is that he started to blame things outside of himself instead of trying to kill his own sin.
Right.
That he tried to kill this arbitrary sin outside of himself and needed a face.
Right. He talked about eliminating temptation.
Right.
Right. But Jesus says in Matthew 15:19, evil comes from within.
Right.
So the evil you need to eliminate is in your own heart.
Right.
So you need to, if you're going to, you kill your sin, not by eliminating externals, but by killing it inside of your own self.
And I would say where I have expressed what role do women play in man's lust? Well, it's not responsibility.
No.
But what I would say is, Philippians tells us to consider others greater than ourselves. And if my suggestion is, not only does the Bible talk about modesty and how that's good, but if someone, my wife has told me, I've heard that men struggle with lust. And so when she became Christian, she said, I wanted to dress modestly because I just wanted to help my brother in Christ out.
Right.
And no one forced her to.
Right.
But it was like, man, what a great attitude to have to say, if I can help, why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Right. And I would liken to, if I knew you struggled with alcoholism, which, Baptist listening, he doesn't. I have the freedom. Your alcoholism is not my fault. I have the freedom to drink beer, right? But why would I do it in front of you if I know you struggle?
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
That's where I think maybe where some of this can play in, where women can help, but it's not responsibility.
Yeah.
Right?
I think what's just important to point out is that there is zero evidence that was he went into massage parlors and murdered people,
right, who
are at work,
right.
So there's no evidence, that all of the whatever lust he was battling in his heart
it was not the fault of these women.
Yeah, and it's just a total what he did was antithetical to the Christian gospel and the exact opposite of how Jesus tells us to deal with any kind of temptation, which is eliminating people is never how you fight temptation. You fight the evil within your own heart. And so, so biblical sexuality, purity culture was the second thing that was blamed. But the first thing that was blamed, of course, of course, in our current culture, was race.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we went to race faster than I go to my freezer for ice cream at night. I mean, just...
You know what's funny?
We got there quick.
You set that up, and I was like, the first few things I said, I was like, I can't say that. And I'll let you as a listener wonder, what was Daniel thinking? But that's why I did not complete that sentence for you, because...
Dirty man.
But yeah, we went to race. And here's the thing. And at the end of the day, here's what I want to get to is, and I guess I'll end with my endpoint first, is that I don't believe this hyper expression of race is a helpful Christian response.
Yeah.
So everything you're about to hear is out of that thought.
Yep.
Right? And so, I mean, what did you hear at first before I get into it? Because I feel like I have a lot to say about this being an Asian guy. But
yeah. Yeah. I mean, I honestly, I was like, not surprised that it went there that quick. So my general thought is, so when I first heard it, I was like, yeah, that doesn't seem to fit to me. But in this, we'll get into this on the Christian response. I'm like, clearly there are people that are experiencing genuine like fear because of this. Like a lot of our Asian American friends felt fear because of this incident. So I want to be good enough at listening to know, okay, that fear that you're experiencing didn't come out of nowhere. So I was trying to be patient to hear, where that may have come from and why something like this would have set that off. So
right.
That's what I was trying to do, which was, okay, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't see where this is coming from. At the same time, people are experiencing genuine fear, so I'm going to try to understand.
Right.
That's kind of where I came from.
Let me ask you this. Did you feel any guilt or responsibility?
No.
Okay. Because I feel like I've talked to some white people that have had a mixed response with that.
They felt a little guilty.
And I'll read a text message that I got the other day that I think this is, if you take this too far, this is what starts happening.
Yeah.
So for me, I was really mad at the Asian Christian response.
Yeah.
And if any of you guys are clicked on my Facebook and you're listening, I don't mean to offend, and I'd love to have a conversation. I've been wondering how to have this conversation with some of my Asian friends on Facebook. But I just felt like it was so hyper-focused on your identity being Asian that you missed the gospel in this situation. And in the culture, if this is your response, I understand it. Because if you are not a Christian, you have to find your identity in something. Everyone finds their identity in something. Why not race? That makes sense to me. But if you're a Christian, your primary identity marker should not be your race. It should be Christ.
Right.
And don't get me wrong, that doesn't negate your cultural upbringing, your experiences, your culture itself, how you look. But it just shouldn't be your primary identity marker. But whether people mean it to or not, that's how it came off.
Right.
And so there's these responses. I listened to some churches who had Asian people speak. I, saw on Facebook and Instagram and all these people. And then it wasn't just the Asian people, but it was just then all of the white people or whatever started chiming in, it started posting about it. But basically the response that I saw was, I'm so scared. I'm so afraid. But to me, that confuses me. I've lived in Atlanta for 32 years. And this is the first time I've heard of anything like this happening.
Interesting.
Right? Who am I supposed to be scared of? Right?
Right.
You asked me the next morning, how are you feeling about this? And you're the only person who asked me that I know. But the thing is, me and my family and who I'm around, wasn't in the situation at all,
Sure.
right? What am I supposed to be scared of, right? I don't feel like I'm going to walk outside and someone's going to attack me. And maybe some of these people are in, but I don't know. I've never experienced that. And I've talked to, and this is split, I've talked to some other Asian friends who feel the same way as I do.
Interesting.
Right? Yes. And, I've even heard a lady say, I'm afraid of inviting my parents to Atlanta. I was like, really? All of Atlanta?
Right.
My
whole
parents,
metro area, yeah.
my parents are almost 70. They've lived here for 40 years, and no one's ever threatened them. Not once. The other thing was blamed on white supremacy, which I thought was really confusing too. In my experience, I have experienced racism from different people. But here's the thing, this is why it's dangerous to blame white supremacy here. The most people who have been racist towards me have been white. But you know who has also protected me and stood up for me and challenged those racists? White people. So how can you blame white supremacy in general, right? This is why I go back to, who am I supposed to be scared of? Because my best friends are white, and they stick up for me like I'm their brother, right? Why am I going to blame this arbitrary idea of white supremacy? I think something about the narrative, about this white supremacy narrative that is interesting too, is if you actually look at the uptick in crimes against Asians, this is what no one's talking about, especially in LA and New York. The majority of people committing these crimes are African Americans. But no one's talking about it because it doesn't fit the narrative.
Right.
And here's what I want to say. The thing is, no one's going to talk about that because it doesn't fit the cultural narrative. But what the culture would tell me is, if you see an uptick of one group of people attacking another group of people, you should blame them all. That's what the culture says. And according to statistics, the culture would have me say I should be afraid of white people and black people. But why? I don't believe that one black person's actions or one white person's actions represent all black people and white people.
Yeah.
How can I say that? That's the problem. We're so quick to throw stones at a whole group of people, as if one Asian represents all Asians, one white person represents all white people, and one black person represents all black people.
Right.
How can that be right? How can that be true?
Yeah.
I've heard of people talking about being erased. I've heard of people saying that they've been victimized their whole life. And if you have, I'm so sorry. I've been a victim of racism multiple times in my life as well. But I think for me, as the Christian response, and we'll get to this, is that my primary identity marker is Christ. And so if you want to attack me for being Asian, I'm going to say, don't do that. Racism is bad. I will absolutely stand with you and shout down racism. Racism is bad, right? But that's not going to destroy me or my identity. My identity is in Christ. You can't destroy that, right? That's the beauty of finding your identity in Christ.
Yeah.
But I think the danger of the Asian response is, I got this text the other day that asked, and this white person asked me this question. I think something I'm curious about is just the way in which you handle injustice as a privileged white person without living under this condemnation that I'm never doing enough and that I'm always the problem.
Wow.
This person texted me this because of the rhetoric that was going around, right? Because of the Stop Asian Hate hashtag and against white supremacy and against all this stuff. She says, I'm white. I guess I'm the problem. I'm guilty.
Right.
But the question is, what did this white person do?
Yep.
You're a white person. What did you do?
Right.
What guilt do you have in the situation?
And that's why we talked about the importance when we were talking about the purity culture thing. You must repent for your sin.
Right.
And which means that you can't repent of a sin that you didn't commit, but that someone else committed that has the same level of melanin in their skin as you do.
Right.
That doesn't work like that.
And I would say, if you're pushing this racial justice stuff, right? Once again, if you see injustice, speak up for justice. Right?
Of course.
I preached on this, yes, but we need to be aware of how our words affect people, because I think there's an increasing amount of white people being like, "Is this my fault?
Sure.
Am I at fault?" Because even one of the things I heard was someone said, "I only had 5 people reach out to me, and I felt really, really disrespected by this community." And I was like, "What are you saying?"
An Asian person.
An Asian person said that.
Okay.
And I was like, that's a slippery slope by saying, if you don't treat me as an Asian person, as you as a white person, me as an Asian person, the way exactly I want to be treated, then you're a racist. That's a slippery, slippery slope.
Yeah.
But that's why I think this person was feeling guilt, because they heard that and said, "Oh my gosh, I didn't reach out. I must be at fault."
And this is exhausting. I'm always at fault because I'm white.
Yeah.
So what do I do?
Yeah.
And the problem, right, is, and we're going to get into this when we're going to talk about critical race theory and how our culture views race versus how the Bible views race soon. But if there's no sin that you committed to repent of, and you are always blamed because the amount of melanin in your skin, it's an endless cycle.
Right.
It's a cycle you never get out of. It's a very destructive, awful cycle.
And the other reason it doesn't make any sense either is because I didn't want anyone to reach out to me. So does this one Asian person speak for me?
Right.
I think as a minority that's been affected here, that people are yelling about right now, I'm like, you don't speak for me.
Sure.
That's the thing. Not all Asian people are the same.
Right.
Not all Hispanics are the same. Not all white people are the same. Not all black people are the same.
Right.
It's,
Yeah.
there are certain things that, like, we all have black hair.
Right.
I guess. There are some things that are the same.
Yeah.
But, we have different experiences. But I think here's the real travesty here is that because of the racism that was pushed here, how much have you heard about the 2 non-Asian people that were murdered?
Right. Equally made in the image of God. Equally valuable.
Do they not count?
Right.
What I saw was ironic and sad was because of this hyper-racializing this event, you almost devalued the 2 other people.
That were of a different race.
No one's talking about them.
Yeah.
People say 8 people, 6 were Asian. No one ever talks about the 2 people.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then and here's the other thing. No one talks about the 6 Asians. Well, I won't say no one. The rhetoric isn't that the 6 Asians are people, they're Asians.
That is a very important point. Yeah.
Right? The world has made their identity marker Asian. They're not people with personalities, with experiences, with whatever. They're Asians.
Very true.
There's 6 Asians and 2 non-Asians. That's all you've heard.
Yep.
Right? I don't want to be marked as Asian guy, right? Asian guy 1.
Right. You're a human being.
I'm a human
made
being.
in God's image with gifts and talents and joys and sorrows and a family and a story.
Right. There's so much more to us than race.
Yeah.
We are not less than our race, right? That does, the culture you're raised in is important to the person you become.
Sure.
Right? But it's not the only thing, and it's not the primary thing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, and so I just think that was just really sad for me to see that people were just, whittled down to just 6 Asians, right?
Yeah.
They didn't, in the world's eyes, they weren't people, they were Asians.
Yeah.
Or non-Asians, right?
Yeah, that's a tragedy of our current worldview.
And here's the thing that, I don't know if you've experienced this too, that I thought is really hard for white people, is what were you supposed to do? Go on your phone and say, "Oh my gosh, let me profile every Asian I have and make sure I text them that they're okay." Right. I'm like, isn't that kind of racist?
Right.
You're only texting me because I'm Asian?
Sure.
Right? There's 2 sides of this coin.
Sure.
That we got to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean those were kind of the 2 stories, right? Of purity culture and race. And so we want to kind of end our time together by talking about how should Christians respond. And I just want to say, I'll kind of let people in, right, to our inner working. So I gave a pastoral prayer on Sunday at our church gathering largely about this, and you and I talked about whether or not I should pray anything regarding race.
Right.
And we decided yes. And so I prayed for the Asian Americans who currently feel afraid.
Yeah, and are hurting.
Mm-hmm. And, you may be wondering, well, I thought you just spent all this time talking about how race may not have had anything to do with it. For me, it's like, okay, that feeling didn't just sprout up overnight, and there are reasons for it, and some of it may be a disingenuous media. That may be a cause. It's probably not the only cause, and so I think when we're thinking about response, I just think we're just so fast to speak and so slow to listen.
Yes.
And so I just want to say in all of this stuff, as we're talking about, as people are critiquing purity culture, maybe just pause and listen to the critique for a minute. As people are saying they think racism was involved, before you rear your head and say, no, it wasn't, just pause for a second and listen. I think Christians, we need to be people of truth, and we should stand on the truth. I also want to be, Jesus was full of grace and truth, and I want to hear people where they're coming from. And so I think that would be one thing about the Christian response is instead of doing what the media did and assigning motives quickly without fact, just take some time to let the truth come out.
Yes.
And I think for me at least, and I'm still a little, frankly, I'm still a little uncomfortable with how to respond. I think acknowledging that someone is struggling, acknowledging that an Asian friend is struggling with this,
is hurt or in pain or scared.
Is hurt or in pain or scared is not the same as maybe acknowledging that they should or shouldn't be.
Right.
Maybe they shouldn't be scared, but maybe they are scared. And so have some empathy, have some concern. That's just one thought on.
Yeah. Pray for them. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, I don't mean to say, oh, all Asian people are wrong in this. That's not what I'm saying.
Sure.
I think there is an element, if you are scared and you see someone hurting, we should care for them.
Right.
Right. So the Christian response should be care.
I am the worst father when, and I do this often, when my 3-year-old, who has been really emotional.
I want to say you are a good dad, though.
Well, thank you. Yeah. But Hannah's been really emotional lately. I guess it's the 3-year-old phase thing or whatever. And often what I tell her to do is to stop it. And you know what? There is some validity to that.
Yeah.
Sometimes I tell her, you know what, Hannah? You can't be a victim always. Sometimes you just gotta get up and stop complaining. You gotta stop whining. You can't whine through life. I think there is a place for that. Sometimes there's a place to say, sweetie, I'm so sorry. And I think that's all of us in this situation, right? Is sometimes we want to just say, stop it. And sometimes we just need to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn.
Right.
And so I know that's a balance, and I know there's an element of discipling people of don't be afraid of something you shouldn't be afraid of and all these things. And there's a time and place for that. But yeah, that's just one thing I'd like to start off with.
Yeah, and I would say too, we talked about the identity stuff. Mm-hmm. As a Christian, you should find your identity in Christ.
Right.
And so practically say, look at your Facebook posts, what you've been posting. What would people say your identity is?
Yeah.
How much have you posted about grace, forgiveness, the gospel, Christ, as you posted you have talked about racism, justice, whatever, right? Yeah. And I would say too, and I preached on this, so you can listen to my sermon if you haven't heard this, but I'll briefly explain. People have been pushing this idea of justice, There's no gospel without justice. I would agree, right? I've heard this so much about race.
Sure.
But do we forget who received justice on the cross? It was Christ. Jesus did. Not us as the sinners.
Right.
Us who deserve to be punished. We
Right.
weren't punished as Christians.
Yeah.
Christ was. And so I would say I feel like what's bothered me is I'm all for saying down with racism. Totally
Of
on
course.
board with that.
Yep.
Yes. Down with racism. Stand up for the oppressed. I'm all for that. But the lack of grace and forgiveness, the talk of grace and forgiveness here is astounding to me from Christians I know.
You know, it is interesting. Remember that, I think, 2015 shooting in Charleston of the Emmanuel AME Church, which clearly was an act of racism. White supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
But what did those church members do?
They went to that courthouse.
They went to that courthouse and said,
Man, I was in tears.
We forgive you because Christ forgave us.
Oh my.
And so what was the media headline? The gospel.
Yeah.
I'll never forget, I was watching The Five on Fox News at 5 p.m. And one of the five is a guy named Greg Gutfeld, very sarcastic. I think he's an agnostic. And I remember watching him watch the members of the Emmanuel AME Church forgive this guy in the courtroom.
Oh my gosh.
He fills with his eyes fill with tears, and he says, y'all know I'm not a very religious person, but I've never seen anything like this in my entire life, and this makes me question everything. That's the power of the gospel to bring reconciliation. So yeah, I think that's so important. For as much as we shout justice,
right,
and we should, and let's be clear, in this case, justice is the impartial application of justice on a, I guess, what would be assumed murderer, like
right,
that this guy gets a fair trial, and the results of that fair trial are equal justice under the law.
Right.
I think that's what's important, because a lot of times when we talk about justice, we don't actually know what we're talking about.
Right.
That's what justice is in this scenario.
Yes.
This guy murdered 8 people.
Yeah.
I guess we're supposed to say allegedly.
Right.
But yeah, we got to talk about the gospel. Grace has to be our main story.
And we talked about that. If you only we should cry for justice because we want evil restrained. Right? We want evil punished. We want to make sure more evil is not committed. Right? But healing, reconciling, restoration doesn't come from justice. It comes from forgiveness.
Yep.
Like internally for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I preached on that, and so I won't go more into that. But I think, too, with the going back to the identity thing, just to remember, if you are a minority, your identity is not minority. It's not victim. If you are a Christian, your identity, you are the son and daughter of the King.
Yeah.
I was telling you a story earlier about I was in kind of Podunk, North Carolina, and people were yelling racial slurs at me. And why did I not bust out or feel destroyed, go into depression, or bust out in anger? Because that's not my identity. You calling me those names? I'm the son and daughter of the King of the universe.
Yeah.
You don't tell me who I am.
Right.
Right? Remember that your identity is Christ.
Man, so you have bought into the sexual revolution. You're a son and a daughter?
Oh man.
That's another podcast.
Are we gonna get canceled? We're gonna get canceled, man.
No, but I think that's such an important. That's so important when, there is a difference between I have been victimized and I am a victim.
Right.
And I think that's really important to get across is we're not denying.
There are victims.
There are people who have been victimized.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
People who have been oppressed, people who have, but who you are, if you're a Christian, is a son or a daughter of the Most High King. You're royal. You have royal blood.
Yeah.
Right. You may also have been oppressed or have been a victim, but your identity is not oppressed victim. Your identity is son or daughter of the Most High King.
Absolutely.
And that's not just important vocabulary or a nuanced grammar. That's like really important.
Right.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll close with this. And if you're wondering why, as a church, do we not blast out all these things on Facebook about race and all this stuff? It's because we want to keep the gospel central. And so I'm going to read this from Center Church that I think is really important. It says, if an element of ministry is not recognized as a result of the gospel, it may sometimes be mistaken for the gospel and eventually supplant the gospel in the church's preaching and teaching. Counseling, spiritual direction, doing justice, engaging culture, doctrinal instruction, and even evangelism itself may become the main thing instead of the gospel. And what we want to do is say this: if you are only posting about this racial stuff as a Christian, people are going to think that that's the gospel.
Yep.
And what we want to do is, yes, justice is part of an application of the gospel. Yeah. We're going to talk about that. We're going to do it. We're going to push that as a church. But that's never going to be our main thing. Nothing is except for the gospel.
Yeah.
The gospel is going to be our main thing. And I would recommend as a Christian that it would be yours as well. The gospel would be the main thing.
That's a good place to stop as we consider and ponder the tragedy and the horror of what happened in Atlanta last week. We are continue to pray for Crabapple Baptist, continue to pray for the family who lost loved ones in this tragedy, and we look to the gospel as the only solution and the only source of our hope. Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Monday Musings. We will talk to you next week.